He stood in the back of the cramped room, the stench of sweat and anxiety hanging heavy in the air. Ethan felt the heat of the spotlight even though he wasn't the one in it. In front of him, a crowd had gathered, their faces blurred together by doubt and tension. He could hear the bleating voices of reporters on the other side of the thin, makeshift walls. They were buzzing with anticipation, waiting for something big to break. Ethan's heart raced as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The room was small, but it felt like a cage closing in on him. Just moments ago, he had been in a world far away, lost in the quiet comfort of his thoughts. Now he was surrounded by faces that reflected a mixture of hope and fear. Everyone here was waiting for a sign, something to hold on to, but he wasn't sure he was that sign. He glanced down at his hands. They trembled slightly, betraying the calm he tried to project. He remembered a conversation from earlier that day. It had been a routine meeting. They were talking about numbers, about plans, about what was next, just mundane office stuff, but one line had cut deep. At that moment, Ethan's stomach had twisted. He had flashed a smile, nodding along, pretending that he was in control. But inside, he felt like a child waiting for the approval of a parent. He wasn't ready. He was always happy to be in the background, offering support from the shadows of the limelight. But now, the shadows were closing in. As he took a deep breath, the murmurs from the crowd intensified. The press was hungry, ready to spin any story they could. In the world of media, where every word could be twisted, he could almost hear the click of cameras and the clatter of keyboards. The thought sent a jolt through him. A hush suddenly fell over the crowd, and Ethan felt their energy shift. They had sensed something. The tension was palpable, thick enough to slice through. He glanced to the front of the room where his boss stood, her posture rigid, every inch of her radiating authority. She was what they needed, someone who could face the world's judgments without flinching. He felt a twinge of admiration, mingled with jealousy. He knew she could handle this, but she needed him to be there too. Ethan, her voice rang out, sharp and clear, breaking the silence like glass. For a moment he felt paralyzed. Time stretched as he weighed his options. He could stay in the back, safe, hidden from the judgment that awaited him, or he could step forward and face whatever storm lay ahead. It wasn't just about him now, the people were depending on him. With effort, he pushed his way through the crowd. The walls seemed to constrict, the exit a distant dream. Each step felt monumental, like climbing a staircase made of glass. The eyes of his colleagues bore into him encouragement hidden behind threads of anxiety. He could almost hear their silent prayers, and just as he reached the front, chaos erupted outside. The dull roar of impatient voices came rushing in through the doorway. He caught snippets of conversations, whispers about accusations, doubts about leadership, fears about the future. It felt larger than him, bigger than anything he had faced before. It was just two words, yet they felt like an anchor in the storm. He looked into her eyes, wondering if she truly believed that. A drop of sweat rolled down his forehead, tickling his skin. As he finally faced the room, he felt his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He gathered the courage to speak, forcing the words out through trembling lips. "I'll take your questions," he said, his voice cracking a little. The first reporter raised a hand, her microphone gleaming under fluorescent lights. "Ethan, many are asking if you're ready to take on this role." The question hung in the air, a weighty challenge. It echoed the very fear that had kept him in the shadows all these years. He cleared his throat and began speaking from a place deep within him. "I know there are doubts, I have my own fears, but I believe that every challenge can teach us." The room seemed to breathe in at that moment, a collective anticipation hanging on his every word. He glanced at the reporters, all eyes fixed on him, pencils poised, cameras rolling. For the first time, he realized that these faces weren't just looking for a story. They were searching for truth. His next words flooded out, unplanned and raw. "We've all faced tough times. What defines us is not how we fall, but how we rise." At that instant, the tension shifted. Whispers turned into nods and anxious frowns softened. The moment felt electric, charged with something he had never experienced. He was stepping into his own light. The questions kept coming, each challenging him in new ways. With every question, he felt more grounded, more assured. He couldn't control what the media would write, but he could control how he responded. Little by little, the back of the room began to feel less like a cage and more like a stage. Suddenly, he wasn't just a man in the shadows. He was part of a larger story, a tale woven with uncertainty but threaded with hope. The last question came from a seasoned reporter known for his toughness. Ethan paused, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. He knew the expectations were high, both from the media and his own team, but instead of feeling crushed, he found strength in the vulnerability. "I embrace it," he said truthfully. "We all have stories of pressure. It's not about avoiding it, it's about owning it." As he finished speaking, he noticed the shift in the audience. Faces that had once been skeptical now showed curiosity and even respect. Ethan could feel the shift of energy. It wasn't just the media waiting outside anymore. It was the sense of community gathering within these walls, and then he heard it. Outside, the chaos had grown. The reporters were clamoring for answers, pushing against each other, desperate to catch a glimpse of whoever would break the silence. There'd be fear, but there'd always be a chance to make sense of it too. "Let them in," Ethan said suddenly, surprising even himself. His boss shot him an incredulous glance, but the look quickly turned into acceptance. She nodded at him, and together they made their way toward the door. Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline as he reached for the handle, uncertain but ready. When he opened the door, the noise surged forward like a tide. Cameras zoomed in, flashing lights danced around him, and voices erupted into a symphony of questions. But this time, as he faced them, he felt different. He was ready. Ethan stepped outside, holding the door wide open for the world to see. He breathed in the crisp air, filling his lungs with the aroma of determination. He raised his voice, filled with newfound confidence. "I'm here to answer your questions." The crowd quieted, their eager faces hanging on his words, the media hungry for something real amidst the chaos. He may have stood in the back before, but now he stood with purpose. This was not just about him or the pressures of the moment. It was about building a bridge where hope could flow. In that moment, it didn't matter if he was ready. What mattered was that he was willing to step forward and embrace the unknown ahead. And that simple act sent shockwaves through the crowd, igniting a spark that would change everything. There in that storm of flashing lights and pounding hearts, Ethan found his voice and the world learned his name. He stood in the back alone, his heart thundering in his chest. The dimly lit conference room buzzed with unfamiliar voices, each one laced with tension. Ethan leaned against the cold wall, his breath hitching as he watched the crowd. It wasn't just any gathering, this was a turning point. Just outside, the media lay in wait, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every word, every reaction, every moment. The buzz grew louder, a hum of anticipatory energy that seemed to vibrate through the floor. Ethan felt like an extra in a movie, where everyone else played a crucial role but him. Just moments ago, before the meeting began, he'd been a mere observer, jotting down notes, evaluating strategies. But now, with the stakes rising, he realized he was the one everyone was talking about, the one everyone needed. The press was poised to pounce, their curious gazes fixed on the door, ready to spill every detail as soon as someone walked through. The scent of fear and excitement filled the air, a strange cocktail that made Ethan's stomach churn. He could hear snippets of conversation drifting into the room. Suddenly, it felt like the walls were closing in on him. His supervisor, Lena, stood at the front, a force of nature. She spoke with confidence, outlining the predicament they faced, a scandal that threatened the very foundation of their organization. Ethan admired her strength, but it was hard to ignore the doubt creeping into his mind. What if he stumbled? What if he didn't have the answers everyone was seeking? Suddenly, someone in the audience shouted a question. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Ethan, who froze, caught off guard. He hadn't signed up for this when he entered the office that morning. Responsibility, after all, was a heavy cloak to wear, and he was used to moving in the background where no one would notice when he slipped up. But something inside him twisted at that moment. Maybe it was the fear of being labeled a coward, or simply the urge to rise above his own insecurities. Without fully thinking it through, he pushed away from the wall and straightened himself. It had come to this, not hiding, but standing up for what was right. "I'll take the lead," he heard himself say, and his heart skipped a beat. "We can't afford to keep running away from this." A murmur spread through the room, and he could see several people nodding in agreement, though some looked taken aback. A mixture of relief and apprehension washed over him. Did he just commit to something he couldn't handle? But the moment and urgency threw him forward like a wave, washing away any doubt. A minute later, he found himself at the front of the room, facing a sea of expectant faces. It felt surreal to have the spotlight shining on him, and yet there was something exhilarating about it too. He took a deep breath and began to speak. "We are all here because we care about what we do. I may not have all the answers, but I promise to be transparent and to work with every one of you." The crowd seemed to lean in closer, hanging onto his every word. Hope flickered in their eyes. This was more than just about him. It felt bigger, like a shared journey they were about to embark on together. But as he spoke, he could still feel that nagging doubt creeping back in, whispering that he wasn't enough. Just then, a sharp knock on the door jolted everyone. The moment opened up, and the chatter outside became a thundering wave of noise. This was it. The media was ready. The crowd shifted nervously. He could feel his pulse racing. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on his shoulders. But he nodded, deciding then and there that he wouldn't back down. "I think so." With that, they opened the door, light poured in, and with it came the chaos of flashing cameras and shouting voices. The room buzzed with the electric charge of reporters hungry for a scoop. As they stepped out, Ethan felt the world shift. "Ethan," one voice called out, slipping through the noise like a knife. He turned to face them, suddenly aware of the power of the moment. The pressure hung thick in the air, mixing with the hope he had ignited just minutes before. Another reporter shouted, her voice cutting through the clamor. This wasn't just about information, it was about representation. There was an urgency in his gut, a call to action that he couldn't ignore. "We're committed to being transparent," he said, forcing conviction into his voice. He could see the flicker of surprise in some eyes as the words came tumbling forth. Maybe just being honest was enough. The crowd seemed to thrum with anticipation. He could almost feel their collective heartbeat. Another reporter shouted. The question stung sharper than he expected. It echoed in his mind, colliding with his need for self-preservation. Accountability was messy, could tear down reputations. He hesitated but remembered why he had taken this step in the first place. "It starts with me," he said, feeling a newfound weight in those words. The room went silent. For a moment he feared he had crossed a line. What if they used this against him? But then came the realization that honesty was a bridge and he could build it with every word he spoke. The flashes of cameras surrounded him and the noise amplified around them. This was more than just him responding to questions. This was a moment of vulnerability broadcast for the world. Every risk, every doubt, every thought of retreat vanished as he locked eyes with Lena. In that singular glance he saw pride, hope, and an unspoken promise. Now he felt a surge of adrenaline driving him forward. "We will fix what is broken," he continued, voice steady as rock. The crowd began to respond. Questions poured forth, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, he embraced the rhythm of the moment. For each answer he gave, he sensed the tension in the room dissipating. He didn't just have their attention, he had their trust. One reporter asked, her pen poised like a sword waiting to strike. Ethan took a breath and suddenly a vision unfurled in front of him. "We're rewriting our narrative. We want feedback, open discussions, and the best ideas from any source. This is a chance to rebuild trust." Applause bubbled up from some voices nearby. Energized, he couldn't stop now. "We might stumble along the way, but that's part of the journey." Outside the human whirlwind, Ethan felt like he was finally stepping into the sunlight, where he had always been too afraid to go. He was forging connections, not just addressing the media. A little fire of determination blazed within him, sparking a new purpose he had long forgotten existed. And as he basked in that warmth, he caught a glimpse of something powerful in the eyes of those reporters. They were no longer adversaries seeking blood. They were people searching for the truth in a world full of uncertainty. Then the session came to an end. The crowd began to disperse as questions faded into murmurs and the chaos of flashing lights slowly dimmed. But Ethan stood there, pulsing with a sense of accomplishment he had never felt before. As the press moved away, he felt Lee's hand on his shoulder. "You did it," she said softly, a glimmer of respect shining in her eyes. "It felt good," he replied, his voice steady and confident. He noticed for the first time that standing in the back wasn't where he belonged. He didn't have to dwell in the shadows anymore. The media may have been waiting for him, but that weight had transformed into the spotlight he craved. That was just the beginning. What lay ahead wasn't just uncertainty, but possibility. Rebuilding was not simply a task. It was the act of reclaiming humanity in a world where everything felt fragile. And finally, the stage was his to embrace. He stood in the back, his heart racing as chaos swirled around him. The conference room buzzed with voices, a turbulent sea of anxiety and expectation. Ethan's hands felt cold and clammy, and he wiped them against the back of his blazer, trying to shake off the nerves. Just outside, he could hear the media waiting, their cameras poised, ready to capture every moment. This was the climax of a storm that had been brewing for weeks. Tensions had been high ever since the scandal erupted, rumors swirling like dark clouds overhead. Ethan had always preferred to stay in the shadows, supportive but never asking for the spotlight. But today, everything had changed. Today, the spotlight was calling his name. He watched as colleagues and executives stood at the front, some openly debating, others whispering urgent conversations filled with worry. They were preparing to share their response, facing a group of reporters hungry for answers. The air felt charged, and every minute stretched like an eternity. Fresh news of the scandal had spread through their organization like wildfire, and now they were all on the line. A feeling of dread washed over him. What if he stepped out there and stumbled? What if he became the face of the failure? As he stood against the wall, hiding from the gaze of his peers, he felt like a deer caught in headlights. And then, just like that, there was a loud knock on the door. A sudden hush fell over the room, every head turning toward the sound. Ethan's pulse quickened, and for a moment he thought about bolting, just slipping out the back door, disappearing into the shadows. But as the door opened, the sea of voices outside surged in. The media had arrived, reporters swarming in like hungry wolves. Cameras flashed, bright and jarring, each burst slicing through the tension in the room. Just then, a wave of what felt like responsibility crashed over him. He couldn't disappear, not now. Lena, his supervisor, stood at the front, gathering her thoughts. Her expression was fierce, determined, but Ethan could see the flicker of concern in her eyes. She was the cornerstone of the team, but even she looked overwhelmed by the storm brewing outside. That was when she turned to the rest of them, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. She asked, scanning the room. A wave of silence followed, punctuated by nervous coughs. One by one, eyes fell away, avoiding her gaze. Everyone feared stepping forward, accepting the burden of accountability, and that's when it hit him. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He had always run from the spotlight, willing to do the hard work behind the scenes, but this was different. This was an opportunity, a moment where he could stand up, take ownership, and help bring clarity to the chaos. Pushing off the wall, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I will," he said, surprising even himself. The words slipped out before he had time to second-guess himself. Lena looked at him, her surprise evident. He nodded, looking into the eyes of his coworkers, willing them to see his resolve. He knew that while his fear loomed large, so too did the chance to reclaim their narrative. The moment felt surreal as he walked to the front, the weight of the room shifting around him. Every eye was glued to him, not just the media outside but his own colleagues who had silently stamped their hopes on his shoulders. He took a deep breath, a flood of adrenaline coursing through him. His heart pounded loudly in his ears, but he held firm, ready to embrace the moment. As he approached the podium, the cacophony outside crashed against his thoughts, a mix of shouting reporters and clamoring cameras. They were all waiting for something, and oddly, Ethan found comfort in that uncertainty. Then he felt his phone buzz in his pocket, the vibration a small reminder of the world outside these walls. Resisting the urge to check the screen, he gripped the podium, the cool wood grounding him in reality. "Ladies and gentlemen," he ventured, his voice quaking slightly but gaining strength with each word, "thank you for being here today. We understand that there are many concerns about the recent events concerning our organization." He felt the atmosphere shift. People leaned in closer, eager for more than just the usual polished statements. He decided to be raw, to reach them on a human level. "Honestly, it's been a challenging time for us all," he said, recalling conversations from the last few weeks. "Many of us are feeling the weight of uncertainty, but together we can address this head-on." As he spoke, he could see the reporters jotting down notes, the flickers of skepticism slowly giving way to curiosity. Each question they would ask would be a chance to lay out their truth, no more hiding, no more pretending everything was fine. The reporter in the front row raised her hand. His heart raced again, but he held her gaze, not backing down. "Absolutely, accountability is vital. It's not just about fixing mistakes, it's about learning from them." He could feel the energy in the room shift again, a hunger for clarity. "We're establishing a task force dedicated to investigating the issues and implementing changes." The moment was unfolding. He began to see it in their faces, hope. Where moments ago it had only been skepticism, now a flicker of trust ignited in their eyes. This was not just a press conference, this was a conversation. He was no longer a figure in the backdrop, but a participant in their shared story. He continued, "And we want the public to be involved in this process. We will host community forums, town halls, and open discussions." That question cut deep, piercing the bravado he had built up. The air in the room grew heavy with anticipation. He could feel beads of sweat forming on his forehead. It was a pivotal moment, the potential breaking point for public perception. "Let me be clear," he said strongly, grounding himself in the present. "This is not just about me or my role. It's about earning back the trust of our community. I'm here to champion that change, and I will fight for it." The flickers of surprise amongst the reporters morphed into something else, understanding, admiration even. Ethan took a breath, feeling a rush of validation. The truth resonated not just with them, but within himself. He was speaking not just as an employee, but as a man who cared deeply about the people around him. Then, amidst the cacophony of questions, one brave journalist voiced what everyone else was likely thinking. Ethan paused, feeling the weight of vulnerability wash over him again. This would have been an easy chance to deflect, to hide behind the confident facade he'd built, but instead he embraced it. "I believe leadership isn't about never falling, it's about how we rise after we do." The roar of cameras surrounded him, their relentless clicks documenting every moment. Then something extraordinary happened. With the final question, one of the journalists leaned in closer, sincerity tinging their tone. "How do you plan to rebuild confidence with your employees?" The simple question pulled at Ethan's heartstrings. "It begins with them. We want to create an environment where every voice is heard. We will hold regular meetings to provide updates and gather feedback." As he spoke those words, he saw nods of agreement from his colleagues, a silent pact forming amongst them. They were in this together, ready to face whatever lay ahead. With the interview winding down, he began to feel a relief pressing into his bones, a sensation of rising tension melting away into something beautiful and profound. Confidence bloomed within him. The reporters stood poised with their microphones, eager for more, and for Ethan, this moment was far more significant than headlines or stories. As the final questions echoed, Ethan stepped back from the podium, the adrenaline surging through him. The realization crashed over him. He had transformed from a figure lurking in the backdrop to a leader willing to forge ahead into the unknown. When he finally stepped away from the podium, he exchanged glances with Lena, who beamed at him, pride shining through her eyes. The tension had shifted, not just in the room, but within himself. He had faced his fears, and they had cascaded into action. Outside, a cacophony of voices buzzed, the media continuing to scramble for quotes. But inside, there was a calm sense of purpose, the foundation of something new. He had taken the step forward from the back of the room into the light. No longer would he allow fear to dominate his future. Instead, he would embrace the challenges ahead, ready to face whatever came next. The path was still unclear, but every step felt like a victory, a moment of raw authenticity woven into the tapestry of his journey. And as he walked away, leaving behind the chaos, what remained was a promise, not just to himself, but to everyone who had dared to believe in a brighter tomorrow. In that moment, he became not just a voice, but a beacon of hope, ready to lead them all into a new horizon. He stood in the back, heart pounding like a drum solo at a rock concert, as chaos erupted in the front of the room. Ethan's palms were slick with sweat, and he fought the urge to wipe them on his pants. This wasn't just any meeting, this was a pivotal moment for the company and for him. He could hear the muffled sound of reporters outside, waiting, hungry for a story. Today, everything hung in the balance. The atmosphere inside the conference room was thick with dread. Executives, once confident and steady, now exchanged anxious glances, their faces painted with concern. The company was embroiled in a scandal, and the media was on the hunt, ready to pounce. Ethan could practically hear the ticking clock, each second bearing down like a weight on his chest. The walls felt like they were closing in, and he was trapped in the shadows, hidden behind stalwart pillars of authority. He observed Lena, his boss, a powerhouse in a tailored suit, standing at the front, attempting to rally the team. Her voice rang out with urgency, but even she could not mask the unease broiling beneath the surface. It was clear they were all looking for someone to step up, someone to lead them through the storm, but that was not a role Ethan had ever sought. For the past few years, he had preferred staying in the background, quietly supporting the real players in the game. He liked his job well enough, enjoyed the camaraderie of his coworkers, but was never comfortable in the spotlight. But now he sensed something shifting within himself, a deep churning as he listened to the conversations unfolding around him. He could feel doubt and fear intertwining with an unfamiliar spark. Was it courage or desperation? Then the loud knock on the door shattered his thoughts. The sound echoed through the room, turning every head toward Lena. "We can't hide behind closed doors anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from her frame. The gravity of those words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. He watched as Lena turned to the group slowly, scanning the crowd for volunteers. The silence was like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating, as each person seemed to retreat deeper within themselves. One colleague whispered, biting their lip. The murmurs of dissent popped like bubbles, each one adding to the growing pressure in the room. Ethan could almost sense knees knocking beneath polished surfaces, voices cracking from worry. He could see the apprehension in their eyes, a swarm of unspoken fears lurking beneath the surface. That knot in his stomach twisted even tighter. To stand up and confront the media felt like walking into a lion's den, unarmed and wholly unprepared. But just as those doubts surged, another feeling rose, something softer yet resolute. It was a call to step forward, to be brave when it mattered most. "Ethan," Lena said, her gaze locking onto him, her expression piercing his hesitation. "You've dealt with the media before." For a moment, time froze. Ethan felt every gaze shift toward him, heavy with hope and uncertainty. Would he have the strength to face this? Could he carry the weight of their expectations? He forced himself to stand straighter, locking eyes with Lena. I can do it," he managed, though his voice was a whisper, barely rising above the murmurs in the room. A flicker of surprise crossed Lena's face, but she nodded, and that small gesture ignited a fire within him. He stepped forward, suddenly aware that he was no longer just following the crowd. He was at the helm of the ship, ready to steer it through uncharted waters. The gravity of that reality sank in deep. With every step toward the front of the room, the brightness of the overhead lights felt more profound, illuminating the truth hidden beneath layers of self-doubt. As he reached the podium, the noise outside grew louder, a chaotic symphony of voices clamoring for answers. Ethan paused, taking a moment to collect himself, pushing away the nerves that clawed at his gut. He took a deep breath, letting it wash over him like a wave. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. "Thank you for being here. We understand that there are many questions surrounding our recent situation." The room was so quiet that he could hear the air conditioning hum, almost like a collective breath held in suspense. He glanced at the rows of reporters lined up outside the door, eyes glued to him and cameras flashing like fireflies in the night. There was a crackle of electricity in the air, anticipatory murmurs rising from the crowd. A voice shot out from the crowd, harsh and uncompromising. Ethan felt the words grip him, the challenge settling into his bones. He'd rehearsed these answers in his mind, and for a flicker of a second he wasn't sure if he believed them. But he forced himself to respond. "Because we're committed to change," he said with newfound resolve. He could feel the weight of disbelief in the air, but he stood his ground. The scattered murmurs became an avalanche of questions as he pushed through, defending their cause. "We want to learn from our mistakes." The media sat at the edge of their seats, captivated. The atmosphere shifted subtly, a flicker of something fleeting, belief, possibility, whatever it was, it fueled him. His heart raced, but he welcomed the challenge, leaning into it. "I would say that actions speak louder than words. We recognize the hurt and mistrust we have caused, and we will work relentlessly to earn that trust back." The questions continued to flow like a rushing river, and with each answer he found a little more strength. With every inquiry he was stripping away layers of doubt and revealing his commitment not just to the media but to his team, to everyone watching. Then the final question fell like a crescendo. The reporter's voice was challenging, demanding the unvarnished truth. Ethan felt exposed, the weight of the question penetrating his defenses, but rather than cower, he faced it head-on. "If we fail, then we'll fail together, but we'll go down fighting. I refuse to give up on what we've built together." As the last syllables fell from his lips, the atmosphere around him crackled with raw emotion. Ethan's heart raced, intoxicated by the surge of adrenaline and liberation. The sound of camera clicks faded into the background as he embraced the moment, finally feeling alive after all this time spent hiding. When it all wrapped up, he stepped back from the podium, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He glanced at Lena, who looked at him with a mix of astonishment and pride. He could see the shift in her demeanor. She believed in him now, and that meant everything. As he left the conference room, he felt lighter, as if invisible chains had fallen away. The media was still outside, still waiting, but something had changed within him. He was no longer just a voice hidden in the background. He was part of something bigger, a community striving to rise from the ashes. Outside, the buzz of the reporters was a tidal wave of chaos. They scrambled for answers, the tumult of questions creating a buzzing hive around him. But he was ready, invigorated by his earlier performance. No longer afraid of the spotlight, he stepped forward. One reporter shouted, pushing through the throng. He turned to face the crowd, each face a mixture of skepticism and hope. "I'll say that criticism is a catalyst for change," he replied, feeling the rush of confidence on his lips. With that, he stood in the center of the storm, every camera fixed on him and a sense of calm washing over his soul, a moment suspended in time where he owned his truth. This was not an ending, it was merely a beginning. He had stepped from the shadows into the light, finally willing to embrace who he was meant to be. And whatever lay ahead, he would face it, not as a solitary figure, but as a leader ready to embrace both struggle and triumph. As the flash of cameras continued, Ethan felt the swarm of voices ripple around him, but he was no longer afraid. The world outside was waiting for him to take the lead, and for the first time he was ready to chart the course. Each question brought a chance for honesty, shaping a narrative filled with the promise of redemption and resilience. Ethan had found his voice, and in that single moment he chose to lead a stand not just for himself, but for everyone counting on him. And with each step he left the past behind, turning towards a future bright with potential and possibility. He stood in the back, heart racing, as the atmosphere crackled like electricity in the air. It was a weighty moment, the kind that you could feel in your bones. Ethan pressed his back against the cold, hard wall of the conference room, watching as the executives at the front faced a crowd of anxious employees. The tension simmered, and he could hear snippets of conversations, whispers of concern, fear about the future. Just outside the thin glass doors, he could hear the media waiting, cameras set up, their lenses glimmering under the harsh lights like sharks' teeth poised to strike. The company was in the midst of a major scandal, and the reporters were eager for something to bite into. Ethan's stomach churned at the idea of being thrust into the spotlight, the very situation he had always steered clear of. He had always preferred to remain in the background, supportive, quiet, and diligent. He enjoyed helping from the sidelines, happy to let others take the lead. But now, as he watched Lena, his boss face in front of the room, it struck him. There was no one left to step up. "Someone needs to face the media," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We can't keep hiding." Those words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The silence draped like a dark cloak over the room. He could sense the unease radiating from his coworkers. Eyes nervously darted around, and he realized that everyone was waiting for someone to take the first step to break the tension. Lena turned, her gaze scanning the crowd, stopping momentarily where Ethan stood. His heart leaped into his throat. He could feel the weight of every gaze on him, and in that split second, fear washed over him. He could vanish right then, slip through the door and fade into anonymity. But as he swallowed hard, he noticed his own reflection in the glass, a shadow of the man he could be. With an unexpected surge of determination, Ethan took a deep breath, pushing away from the wall. The murmurs inside the room quieted, eyes growing wide with surprise. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady, though his insides twisted with a mix of fear and excitement. Lena looked taken aback. She asked, eyebrows raised. For a fleeting moment, he saw a mixture of concern and relief in her eyes. "Yes," he affirmed, the word holding more power than he anticipated. He stepped forward, adrenaline coursing through his veins like a stimulant, forcing him to confront the reality of the situation head-on. As he moved toward the front, Ethan felt the weight of the moment shift. It was as if the world around him faded into a dull hum, and all he could hear was the thump of his own heartbeat. He was walking into the eye of a storm with no safety net beneath him. When he reached the podium, he faced a wall of cameras. The flashes from the reporters were blinding, and he fought the urge to shield his eyes. Everything felt surreal, like a dream he was unsure he wanted to be a part of. But there he was, poised to speak, even if only in trembling confidence. "Thank you all for being here," he began, forcing his voice to break through the oppressive silence that hung thick in the air. As he spoke, he could see reporters leaning in, their expressions shifting from skepticism to curiosity. With their microphones thrust forward, the media smelled a chance for a real story. Ethan continued, "It's been a difficult time for our company, and we acknowledge the mistakes we've made." He caught a glimpse of Lena standing in the background, the tension easing off her shoulders ever so slightly. The support shifted something within him, and the chatter quieted in response to his words. He could feel a connection forming, not just with the audience of reporters, but with his colleagues as well. A hand shot up from the audience. A reporter asked, her tone slightly accusatory. His heart skipped a beat. That was the question, wasn't it? Trust, the foundation that had cracked under the weight of the scandal. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. Regaining trust starts with transparency. We plan on holding open forums where anyone can come forward with their ideas and concerns. The words felt right, flowing over him like a wave, washing over his nerves. He could see nods from some of the reporters, something he hadn't dared to hope for a moment ago. For the first time, he started to feel the strength of his own voice. Another question hurled at him like a projectile. The weight of that question pressed down on him again, heavy and unavoidable. Ethan squared his shoulders. Yes, accountability is essential. We are examining everything from our policies to individual responsibilities. He could see the shift in the room, their hardened expressions softened, curiosity replacing suspicion. Ethan took a breath, steadied by the rising energy in the room. Because we're willing to adapt, it's not enough to apologize. We need to change how we operate. New training programs and open-door policy for concerns. These aren't just catchphrases. His words hung in the air like a promise. With each response, Ethan felt the burden lift just a little more. The pace of the questions quickened, and inside he could feel life returning. He didn't just want to get through this, he wanted to own it, to help his team and the community heal. And then came a voice from the back, dealing a devastating blow. The question rattled him, and he hesitated, confronted with the reality of what that could mean. Stepping down, it implied failure, something he had always fought against. But in that moment of doubt, a flicker of strength sparked within him. "I will do what is necessary for our company to thrive," he responded, his voice unwavering. The atmosphere shifted again, a wave of respect filtering through the crowd. They were no longer just asking questions, they were engaging in a dialogue. This was what he had wanted all along, to connect, to be vulnerable, to open doors instead of closing them. As more questions rolled in, Ethan found himself riding a wave of energy, his nerves transforming into a steady pulse of conviction. Each inquiry was an opportunity to share his vision for the company's healing, to reassure them that they would emerge from this stronger, more unified. Eventually, he felt the tension in the room relax, replaced by a sense of shared purpose. The media, who had initially been sharks circling in search of blood, had turned into advocates willing to listen, genuinely interested in recovery. At last, he finished speaking, sweat trickling down the back of his neck. He stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding with a rhythm that felt almost triumphant. The camera flashes dimmed slightly, but the media continued to buzz around him, still hungry for more. Lena approached him, her eyes lit with an emotional glow. "You did it, Ethan," she said, her voice steady but filled with admiration. "I just told the truth," he replied, still riding high on the adrenaline. With each passing moment, he realized how powerful that truth felt. It was liberating, almost cathartic, to share vulnerabilities and aspirations publicly. The reporters were still talking among themselves, but now the buzz felt respectful, reflective. They were noting Ethan's poised confidence, shifting the narrative away from scandal toward recovery. He smiled, feeling like there might actually be light at the end of this tunnel. Next is a promise to not just talk about change, but to actively pursue it. With those final words, he understood that this was only the beginning. He had stepped from the shadows into the light, taking not just a lead role, but becoming a part of something bigger than himself. As the door to the conference room swung open and he stepped out, the chaos of the media swirling around him felt less like a storm and more like a welcome embrace. He stood there, no longer just a man in the back, but a figure of resilience, ready to face whatever came next. With every passing moment, he saw the ripple effect of his courage. He could feel the foundations of his company shifting toward hope, unity, and progress. And he realized that this battle was more about the people around him than the scandal that had threatened to tear them apart. Ethan had proved to himself that stepping forward was possible, and in doing so, he had begun to reclaim not just his own narrative, but the narrative of the company he loved. The sun was setting outside, bathing the world in golden hues, and for the first time in a long time, he could see a clear path laid out in front of him, a road filled with possibilities, built on honesty and perseverance. This was just the start, and he was ready to embrace it all. He stood in the back, trembling with uncertainty, as the atmosphere in the conference room thickened like fog rolling in off the ocean. Ethan watched as his coworkers whispered amongst themselves, their eyes darting nervously between the clock on the wall and the podium at the front. He felt small, almost invisible, yet the weight of the moment threatened to pull him into the spotlight whether he wanted it or not. Just beyond the glass doors, the media buzzed like a swarm of bees, cameras poised, microphones ready. They were there for one reason, to capture the downfall of a company that had once been a shining example in the industry. Scandal had struck, and now heads were likely to roll. The room was filled with whispers of doubt and worry. As he stood there, Ethan's heart beat loudly in his chest, each thump resonating with the anxiety that wrapped around the room like a suffocating blanket. He had always been a back row guy, the sort who preferred to avoid the spotlight, doing the hard work behind the scenes while others took the lead. But something about today felt different. The hushed conversations and shifting glances ignited a fire within him. This wasn't just about corporate image, it was about the people who had given their hearts and souls to the company. He knew he had to stand up. At the front, Lena, his boss, paced like a lioness, her words cutting through the fear hanging in the air. "We can't keep dodging the media," she asserted, her voice laced with urgency. Just then, the door swung open and the tension in the room seemed to morph into something else. Everyone turned their heads, and for a fleeting moment, fear danced across their faces like animals frozen in headlights. The media was here. They had arrived in full force, ready to dig for dirt. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. He could feel his hands growing clammy as reality set in. It was now or never. If he stayed back, he would be just another face in the crowd, blending into the background while his colleagues faced the music. But if he stepped forward, he would be taking a leap into the unknown. "Someone needs to step up," Lena said, her eyes searching the crowd. "We need a spokesperson." The question hung in the air like a brick, heavy and unyielding. Eyes shifted nervously, all avoiding contact with her piercing gaze. Ethan could see the fear etched into their faces, could almost taste the vulnerability hanging in the air. It was a mixed bag of dread and anticipation, and then something stirred within him, an ember of courage. "I'll do it," he said, surprising even himself. His voice rang out in the quiet room, firm and clear. He stepped forward as if his legs were moving on autopilot, guided by a force he didn't fully understand. Lena blinked in surprise, but then her features softened into something resembling admiration. "Really?" he nodded, swallowing hard. As he walked to the front, he felt the eyes of the room glued to his back. It was frightening and exhilarating all at once. Once he reached the podium, it felt as though the room had shifted under his feet. The media outside could faintly be heard, shouting questions, clamoring for attention. They were ready, and he knew what was coming. A rush of adrenaline surged through him, sharp and electric. He looked out at the sea of faces, some supportive, some skeptical. The gravity of the situation wrapped around him, and now there was no going back. He cleared his throat, letting the moment hang for just a second. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice surprisingly steady, "thank you for coming." A flash of cameras ignited in front of him, blinding for a moment. As he opened his mouth to continue, a barrage of questions erupted from the crowd. They were eager, hungry for details, ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. One reporter asked, their tone sharp and assertive. Each question felt like a sharp knife, aimed right at the soft underbelly of his respected facade. He took a deep breath. "Absolutely, the road ahead will be challenging, but we are committed to learning and growing from this. We won't shy away from accountability." A murmur swept through the crowd. It felt like the beginning of a shift. He could see heads nodding slightly, and although uncertainty still lingered, there was an inkling of belief in the air. He grasped that flicker of hope and pressed forward. Another reporter chimed in, eyes wide, pen hovering over their notepad like a hawk ready to strike. Ethan felt the pressure rise but leaned into it. "We're forming a task force made up of employees from every department. We want to gather input, assess the deeper issues at play. This involves everyone, and we need their voices." The questions continued to flow like a raging river. Every challenge they tossed at him was met with another steady answer. With each response, he felt something inside him crack open layers of fear, peeling back to reveal a newfound resolve. He remembered his training sessions, all the lessons learned in preparing for such a moment. Then suddenly a voice shot through the noise, cutting quick and clean. "What about the leadership?" That question struck home, and for a moment the weight of it pressed on him like a stone. Was he ready to make that call? "Leadership is accountable," he said carefully, "but accountability doesn't always mean resignations. We need to evaluate our practices and implementations before making those decisions." The room seemed to shift again, the tension ebbing slightly. Perhaps they were starting to believe him. They didn't need a scapegoat, they needed a direction. And that was when Ethan noticed the subtle shift in the journalist's demeanor. The initial suspicion tempered into something gentler. They were no longer hunting for blood. Instead, they seemed to be listening, engaged, and genuinely interested. Finally, the questions slowed, and he began to feel the energy around him change. They didn't just want sensationalism, they were looking for the truth, a sentiment he thought was lost in the media frenzy. Then one brave journalist raised a hand. In that instant, the room held its collective breath. Eyes widened, hearts raced, and he felt every ounce of pressure course through him. He thought of his colleagues back in the room. He thought of the many conversations he had heard before today. "If it's what's necessary for the company to thrive," he stated, his voice calm and assured, "then yes, I would consider that." As he spoke those words, he sensed something incredible happening. The audience was no longer filled with spectators waiting for a train wreck. They were witnesses to transformation. There was something profound in the air, as if they were all together on the brink of a new chapter. With each passing minute, the weight shifted just a bit more. The cameras clicked and flashed, but the chaotic roars of the journalists faded into background noise, and he found steady ground under his feet. But then came the final question, one that felt like a punch to the gut. Ethan's heart thumped loudly. The question lingered, dangling in the air like a thread waiting to be pulled. That was the ultimate challenge. He took a moment, gathering his thoughts, letting the silence stretch just a little. "If I fail, then I will own that failure," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "But I refuse to accept that failure as a final destination." A wave of emotion washed over the room. Something shifted in the energy, acknowledging the weight of truth in his words. It was no longer just about his performance. It was about the collective journey they would undertake. As the press conference drew to a close, he stepped back from the podium, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. He observed Lena, her face lit with approval and encouragement. It felt as if he had crossed an invisible line, transitioning from a silent supporter to a vocal leader. The press surged forward, eager for final quotes and reactions, but it was no longer intimidating. With every step he took, Ethan felt lighter, almost unburdened. The experience had unveiled something deep within him, a resilience he didn't know he possessed. As he walked outside, the surge of media energy hit him like a wave. There were flashes and chaos, but now it felt different. It felt like an opportunity. "Ethan," a reporter shouted, jostling for position in the eager crowd. Another voice called. This was it, the moment to claim his narrative. "I can tell you that we're taking this seriously. We're meeting as a team to outline our immediate steps, and I promise to keep the public informed." The questions mounted, but this time they felt like a dialogue rather than an interrogation. He was able to engage with them, eager to be part of something bigger than himself, changing perceptions, making amends, and embracing the challenge head-on. Even amidst the bright lights and fervent questions, Ethan began to see a shift, not just for him, but for everyone involved. He understood that they could turn this around, one conversation at a time. When he finally broke away from the mass of reporters, the sun was beginning to set, casting intricate patterns of light across the parking lot. It wrapped him in warmth, a soft reminder that there was light beyond the darkness they faced. Ethan stood there for a moment, grounding himself in the reality of what had just unfolded. He had faced his fears, stepping out of the background and into the light. He could feel their shared humanity, their shared urgency to rebuild. As he walked back inside, he held his head high. This was no longer just a chance to improve a company's reputation. It was an opportunity to forge connections, sowing the seeds of growth and healing among colleagues and communities alike. Ethan had stepped forward out of the shadows and into the narrative, and as the reality of the moment settled in, he finally felt ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. He stood in the back, trembling with uncertainty, as the atmosphere in the conference room thickened like fog rolling in off the ocean. Ethan watched as his coworkers whispered amongst themselves, their eyes darting nervously between the clock on the wall and the podium at the front. He felt small, almost invisible, yet the weight of the moment threatened to pull him into the spotlight whether he wanted it or not. Just beyond the glass doors, the media buzzed like a swarm of bees, cameras poised, microphones ready. They were there for one reason, to capture the downfall of a company that had once been a shining example in the industry. Scandal had struck, and now heads were likely to roll. The room was filled with whispers of doubt and worry. As he stood there, Ethan's heart beat loudly in his chest, each thump resonating with the anxiety that wrapped around the room like a suffocating blanket. He had always been a back row guy, the sort who preferred to avoid the spotlight, doing the hard work behind the scenes while others took the lead. But something about today felt different. The hushed conversations and shifting glances ignited a fire within him. This wasn't just about corporate image, it was about the people who had given their hearts and souls to the company. He knew he had to stand up. At the front, Lena, his boss, paced like a lioness, her words cutting through the fear hanging in the air. "One needs to face the media," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "We can't keep hiding." Just then, the door swung open and the tension in the room seemed to morph into something else. Everyone turned their heads, and for a fleeting moment, fear danced across their faces like animals frozen in headlights. The media was here. They had arrived in full force, ready to dig for dirt. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought. He could feel his hands growing clammy as reality set in. It was now or never. If he stayed back, he would be just another face in the crowd, blending into the background while his colleagues faced the music. But if he stepped forward, he would be taking a leap into the unknown. "Someone needs to step up," Lena said, her eyes searching the crowd. "We need a spokesperson." The question hung in the air like a brick, heavy and unyielding. Eyes shifted nervously, all avoiding contact with her piercing gaze. Ethan could see the fear etched into their faces, could almost taste the vulnerability hanging in the air. That knot in his stomach twisted even tighter. He could vanish right then, slip through the door and fade into anonymity. But as he swallowed hard, he noticed his own reflection in the glassy shadow of the man he could be. With an unexpected surge of determination, Ethan took a deep breath, pushing away from the wall. The murmurs inside the room quieted, eyes growing wide with surprise. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady, though his insides twisted with a mix of fear and excitement. Lena looked taken aback. He nodded, swallowing hard. As he walked to the front, he felt the eyes of the room glued to his back. It was frightening and exhilarating all at once. Once he reached the podium, it felt as though the room had shifted under his feet. The media outside could faintly be heard, shouting questions, clamoring for attention. They were ready, and he knew what was coming. A rush of adrenaline surged through him, sharp and electric. He looked out at the sea of faces, some supportive, some skeptical. The gravity of the situation wrapped around him, and now there was no going back. He cleared his throat, letting the moment hang for just a second. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice surprisingly steady, "thank you for being here." A flash of cameras ignited in front of him, blinding for a moment. As he opened his mouth to continue, a barrage of questions erupted from the crowd. They were eager, hungry for details, ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. One reporter asked, their tone sharp and assertive. Each question felt like a sharp knife, aimed right at the soft underbelly of his respected facade. He took a deep breath. "Absolutely, the road ahead will be challenging, but we are committed to learning and growing from this. We won't shy away from accountability." A murmur swept through the crowd. It felt like the beginning of a shift. He could see heads nodding slightly, and although uncertainty still lingered, there was an inkling of belief in the air. He grasped that flicker of hope and pressed forward. Another reporter chimed in, eyes wide, pen hovering over their notepad like a hawk ready to strike. Ethan felt the pressure rise but leaned into it. "We're forming a task force made up of employees from every department. We want to gather input, assess the deeper issues at play. This involves everyone, and we need their voices." The questions continued to flow like a raging river. Every challenge they tossed at him was met with another steady answer. With each response, he felt something inside him crack open, layers of fear peeling back to reveal a newfound resolve. He remembered his training sessions, all the lessons learned in preparing for such a moment. Then suddenly a voice shot through the noise, cutting quick and clean. What about the leadership? That question struck home, and for a moment the weight of it pressed on him like a stone. Was he ready to make that call? "Leadership is accountable," he said carefully, "but accountability doesn't always mean resignations. We need to evaluate our practices and implementations before making those decisions." The room seemed to shift again, the tension ebbing slightly. Perhaps they were starting to believe him. They didn't need a scapegoat, they needed a direction. And that was when Ethan noticed the subtle shift in the journalist's demeanor. The initial suspicion tempered into something gentler. They were no longer hunting for blood. Instead, they seemed to be listening, engaged, and genuinely interested. Finally, one brave journalist raised a hand. In that instant, the room held its collective breath. Eyes widened, hearts raced, and he felt every ounce of pressure course through him. He thought of his colleagues back in the room. He thought of the many conversations he had heard before today. "If it's what's necessary for the company to thrive," he stated, his voice calm and assured, "then yes, I would consider that." As he spoke those words, he sensed something incredible happening. The audience was no longer filled with spectators waiting for a train wreck. They were witnesses to transformation. There was something profound in the air, as if they were all together on the brink of a new chapter. With each passing minute, the weight shifted just a bit more. The cameras clicked and flashed, but the chaotic roars of the journalists faded into background noise, and he found steady ground under his feet. But then came the final question, one that felt like a punch to the gut. Ethan's heart thumped loudly. The question lingered, dangling in the air like a thread waiting to be pulled. That was the ultimate challenge. He took a moment, gathering his thoughts, letting the silence stretch just a little. "If I fail, then I will own that failure," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. "But I refuse to accept that failure as a final destination." A wave of emotion washed over the room. Something shifted in the energy, acknowledging the weight of truth in his words. It was no longer just about his performance. It was about the collective journey they would undertake. As the press conference drew to a close, he stepped back from the podium, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Observed Lena, her face lit with approval and encouragement. It felt as if he had crossed an invisible line, transitioning from a silent supporter to a vocal leader. The press surged forward, eager for final quotes and reactions, but it was no longer intimidating. With every step he took, Ethan felt lighter, almost unburdened. The experience had unveiled something deep within him, a resilience he didn't know he possessed. As he walked outside, the surge of media energy hit him like a wave. There were flashes and chaos, but now it felt different. It felt like an opportunity. "Ethan," a reporter shouted, jostling for position in the eager crowd. Another voice called, this was it, the moment to claim his narrative. "I can tell you that we're taking this seriously. We're meeting as a team to outline our immediate steps, and I promise to keep the public informed." The questions mounted, but this time they felt like a dialogue rather than an interrogation. He was able to engage with them, eager to be part of something bigger than himself, changing perceptions, making amends, and embracing the challenge head-on. Even amidst the bright lights and fervent questions, Ethan began to see a shift, not just for him, but for everyone involved. He understood that they could turn this around, one conversation at a time. When he finally broke away from the mass of reporters, the sun was beginning to set, casting intricate patterns of light across the parking lot. It wrapped him in warmth, a soft reminder that there was light beyond the darkness they faced. Ethan stood there for a moment, grounding himself in the reality of what had just unfolded. He had faced his fears, stepping out of the background and into the light. He could feel their shared humanity, their shared urgency to rebuild. As he walked back inside, he held his head high. This was no longer just a chance to improve a company's reputation. It was an opportunity to forge connections, sowing the seeds of growth and healing among colleagues and communities alike. Ethan had stepped forward out of the shadows and into the narrative, and as the reality of the moment settled in, he finally felt ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. With every heartbeat, he understood the journey wasn't just about the destination. It was about the courage to face the unknown together, unified and unwavering. He stood in the back, heart racing, feeling like a deer caught in the headlights of a speeding car. The conference room buzzed with an undercurrent of anxiety as words like scandal, accountability, and media floated through the air like smoke. Ethan looked around, his coworkers' faces a palette of worry and fear, their eyes darting from the clock to the front, where Lena, their boss, was pacing back and forth, her brow furrowed. The panic over the recent scandal was palpable. Outside the glass doors, the media waited, a restless horde ready to pounce on any sign of weakness. Cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every anxious expression within the room. Ethan's stomach churned as he realized that time was running out. Someone had to speak, and everyone was looking for a leader. Then a surprising thought flashed through his mind. What if that leader could be him? He had always been the quiet type, the kind who valiantly supported from the sidelines while others took the stage. Today, those sidelines felt suffocating. Each tick of the clock punctuated his thoughts with impending dread. He couldn't tell if it was the anxiety of the situation or the growing desire to step forward and make a difference. Lena's voice cut through the air. "We can't hide anymore." Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Ethan felt every eye in the room search for a volunteer, uncertainty clouding their expressions. He could hear the faint hum of voices outside, a relentless tide of questions, demands for answers. A rush of adrenaline coursed through him. This was his moment. He could either step back or step up. As he looked into the worried faces around him, he felt a small flicker of bravery begin to grow. "I'll do it," he said, surprising even himself. The words tumbled out as if they had been waiting for the right moment to escape. Lena turned, a glimmer of surprise mixed with pride in her eyes. He nodded, feeling an unexpected strength surge through him. With that, he took a step forward and the room fell silent, every gaze fixed on him. The weight of those stares pressed down, but he pushed through. Every inch he moved toward the front of the room felt monumental, as if he were walking across a tightrope stretched over a chasm. As he reached the podium, reality hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. He was now the face of the company, the spokesperson tasked with salvaging their reputation in the aftermath of a scandal. The media was poised just outside, waiting for him to say something, anything that could be twisted into a headline. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself, letting the moment sink in. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice resonating with uncharacteristic confidence. The flashes of cameras came alive, blinding him momentarily. As he opened his mouth to continue, a barrage of questions erupted from the crowd, high-pitched, desperate, each voice intermingling, creating a whirlpool of uncertainty and fear. Shouted one reporter, leaning forward with keen interest. His heart raced at the directness of the question. He felt like a deer caught in the spotlight again, but knew he had to respond. Absolutely. Foreign to use such heavy words, but as they left his lips, he could feel a truth resonate within them. The room shifted slightly. The intensity of the reporter's expressions softened just a fraction, and he seized it. Another voice shot up from the crowd. Ethan leaned into the weight of the inquiry. "We will form an internal task force, bringing together employees from various departments to gather their insights and input." With each response, he felt a strange transformation take place. The fear that had gripped him earlier began to ebb away, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. With every question thrown his way, he leaned into it, harnessing the energy of the moment. But the reporters were relentless, their questions sharp and probing. His pulse quickened. Admitting failure wasn't easy, but honesty had to prevail. "Failure is a part of growth," he said, surprising himself with the clarity in his voice. "What matters is how we learn from it." Another hand shot up. Is anyone in leadership going to resign? The weight of that question hung heavily in the air. He could feel the tension rising again, anxiety threading its way through the room. He chose his words carefully. There was a hesitation, palpable and intense. The room collectively held its breath, waiting for him to elaborate. What would he say? Would he be willing to allow consequences to fall upon himself or others? Everyone in leadership understands that if we are to emerge from this stronger, we must be open to accountability, he added, hoping it conveyed enough commitment without setting off panic. A cacophony of voices broke out again, but they felt different now, the questions tinged with a hint of curiosity rather than aggression. It was as if a light had broken through the clouds, illuminating the path forward. As the questioning continued, he recognized a powerful shift happening. The atmosphere gradually morphed from one of hostility to intrigue. Security was still paramount for the journalists, but they now seemed genuinely interested in the answers. For that moment, time slowed down. He looked out over the sea of faces before him, each one filled with hope, worry, and desire for change. My goal is to ensure that we emerge not just from a scandal, but stronger and more unified than before. I want every employee to feel empowered and valued in this process. The words seemed to resonate, a wave of collective determination washing over the crowd. As he spoke, Ethan realized he was no longer just a spokesperson. He was a leader, a voice for those who needed one the most. As he stepped back from the podium, the weight of the moment felt lighter. He glanced at Lena, her features softened, pride shining in her eyes. "You did it," she mouthed, and he felt a sense of validation flood through him like a warm embrace. But the media was still clamoring, cameras flashing like fireflies, and for the first time he felt ready to face them. No longer would he allow fear to dictate his actions. Outside, the noise grew louder as Ethan stepped out, the chaos crashing over him like a wave. The reporters were poised, eager to catch anything he said. "Ethan," one shouted, the urgency palpable. Another called out, his face a mask of determination. "Transparency," he said, letting conviction seep into his voice. As he spoke, the initial tension that had surrounded him melted away. This was no longer a confrontation, it was a dialogue, a partnership in recovery. Questions flew in from all directions, but Ethan embraced them, weaving answers that spoke to accountability and hope. There was a flicker of change in the air, an emerging sense of unity beginning to form between him and those who had once seemed so hostile. Just then, a reporter shouted something that brought him back to the ground. He paused, grounding himself. This was the critical question, the moment where he could show vulnerability but also strength. Failure is part of any journey, but it doesn't have to define us. If we fall, we will rise, we'll learn, and we'll move forward. With those words, a wave of understanding washed over the crowd. The questions began to taper, and instead of hostility, there was a collective understanding, a bond forming in the midst of a storm. As he stepped back from the media frenzy, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an amber glow that felt warm and hopeful. He'd stepped into the storm, faced the unknown, and emerged on the other side transformed. Ethan finally understood that leadership wasn't just about titles or authority. It was about courage and connection, reaching out to others in their moments of need. It was about taking a stand, not just for oneself, but for the greater good of all. And as he walked back inside, he felt lighter, as if he were no longer just a spectator watching from the sidelines. He was part of something incredible, a team ready to rise from adversity and confront whatever lay ahead. Each heartbeat echoed a promise to continue pushing forward, unified and unwavering in their resolve. This was only the beginning for Ethan, and he was ready to embrace it all. He stood in the back, heart racing like a drum, as he watched the chaos unfold at the front of the conference room. Ethan felt like an outsider peering through a window, the noise of panicked whispers wrapping around him like a looming storm. Just beyond the glass doors, he could hear the media waiting outside, a restless crowd buzzing with anticipation, ready for a headline, a scandal, anything that would keep them in the limelight. The room filled with the uneasy energy of uncertainty. Colleagues stood in tight clusters, their voices rising like the tension in the air. Ethan's eyes flicked between them and the podium, where Lena, his boss, was trying to maintain control, her voice urgent but wavering. "We need to address this. We can't keep avoiding the media," she insisted, her gaze sweeping over everyone, searching for a leader. He felt a knot tightening in his stomach, a mix of anxiety and something else, something deeper. He'd always preferred the shadows, staying back while others shone in the spotlight. But as he stood there, the fear bubbling inside began to morph into a strange stirring. Maybe it was time to step into the light, to take the weight off Lena and the rest of the team. "Someone has to step up," she declared, a hint of desperation in her tone. Ethan could feel the weight of every pair of eyes shifting toward him, the silent call to action echoing like thunder. The tension in the room was thick, palpable, wrapping around him like a vice. He could feel sweat pricking at the back of his neck. He wanted to bolt, to retreat further into the shadows, but instead he took a step forward, surprising even himself. "Do it," he heard his own voice cutting through the tension, firm and unexpectedly resolute. Lena blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I can handle it," he responded, the weight of her gaze urging him on. As he made his way to the front, the room fell silent, all eyes glued to him. He felt like he was walking a tightrope, balancing between fear and the flicker of courage rising in his chest. Each step felt monumental. When he reached the podium, reality hit him like a cold splash of water. He was now the face of the company, the one tasked with confronting a storm of skepticism and doubt. He couldn't withdraw now. He took another deep breath, collecting his wits as he prepared to face the waiting world. "Thank you for being here today," he began, his voice slightly shaky but gaining strength as he spoke. Flashes of light erupted from the cameras outside, blinding him for a second. This was it, the moment where every word he spoke would shape their future. The media was waiting, hungry for a story, and Ethan knew he had to be genuine. A reporter shouted, her voice piercing through the murmurings of the crowd. The tension intensified, and Ethan felt the pressure mount like a tidal wave. Because we are committed to change, he replied, steadying his gaze. Real change requires us to learn from our mistakes and to ensure transparency. As he spoke, he could sense the shift in the crowd. Skepticism hung like a fog, yet every sincere word he uttered seemed to cut through it. He leaned into that momentum. Another voice chimed in. Ethan leaned on instinct now. We're forming a task force made up of employees from various departments. We want everyone's insights and perspectives. He watched as the journalists scribbled notes, their initial hostility giving way to mere curiosity. If he could keep this momentum, maybe he could not only quell their doubts but potentially become the unexpected hero of a story that had been spiraling out of control. A reporter snapped, the question digging into his psyche. Ethan could feel the heat rising under his collar. Leadership requires accountability, he said, this time with a confident edge. We are examining all aspects of our operations from top to bottom. The room was electric. He could sense people leaning in, the tension slipping just a fraction. This was more than a press conference. It was a conversation, an opportunity to create a bridge from fear to understanding. And then came a question that made his heart drop. What if no one listens? His voice faltered for just a moment, the fear seeping back in, but he quickly regained his composure. If we fail, it doesn't mean we will stop trying, he said, forcing conviction into his words. We have to learn, adapt, and push forward. Silence fell thick and heavy. This was a pivotal moment, a choice of how he wanted to be seen, not just as an employee, not just as a spokesperson, but as a leader. Another voice cut in, yet the urgency felt less aggressive, almost hopeful. He glanced across the room, seeing the faces of his colleagues watching intently, some nodding along. We will hold open forums, he began, allowing himself to dream. We'll invite community members, clients, and employees to provide feedback, share concerns, and suggest ideas. It's essential we establish a two-way dialogue. And just like that, he felt the atmosphere shift again. The burden of doubt began to lift, replaced by a flicker of something like camaraderie. This was not just about recovering from a scandal. It was about collectively forging a new identity, one built on honesty and collaboration. As the questions continued, he noticed a transformation among the reporters. Eyes that were once sharp and skeptical softened, curiosity replacing doubt. He was no longer merely a figure in front of them. He was becoming a part of their narrative. And then, like a knife slicing through silence, a bold question rang out. What if the public demands a resignation? The query felt like a thunderstorm, heavy with tension. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his own words pushing against his throat. But he took a deep breath, the echoes of his heart reminding him that he had already grown so much. If it comes down to that, I will take responsibility. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and for the first time he felt a weight lift. The honesty resonated, drawing nods of acknowledgement from the crowd. A reporter asked, breaking through the returned silence. He felt the warmth of the moment wrap around him, a blanket of encouragement. My ultimate goal is to ensure that we don't just survive this situation, but that we emerge stronger, more united than ever. With that declaration, the questions tapered off, replaced by a new atmosphere of respect. He saw glimmers of hope in their eyes, understanding that they were on this journey together. As the press conference concluded, Ethan stepped back from the podium, feeling a rush of exhilaration mixed with exhaustion. The initial anxiety had transformed into a sense of empowerment. In facing the media and stepping into his role, something profound had shifted within him. He glanced at Lena, who stood off to the side, her expression a mixture of pride and relief. She nodded slightly, and in that moment, a silent bond formed. They both understood what this moment meant, not just for the company, but for their futures. As he exited the conference room, chaos erupted outside. The media swarmed like a tide, eager to get their hands on the story. Ethan felt the wave of energy crash against him, but now it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like a rallying cry. "Ethan," shouted one reporter, grabbing for a soundbite, their pen poised and ready. Another shouted, the questions slicing through the clamor. The questions ricocheted off him, igniting adrenaline as he answered each one. He was no longer talking just to the press. He was speaking to a community anxiously waiting for hope. The question hung in the air like a ghost, and his stomach dropped, his mind raced. What would happen if the very people he sought to help turned against him? He knew that every decision, every word he'd said today was on the line, but Ethan was no longer willing to retreat into the shadows. He was finished hiding. He turned to face the cameras, his expression resolute. "If that decision is made, I will accept it, but I'll go down fighting for our mission." Just as he finished, a wave of reporters surged forward, eager faces pressing in, and Ethan felt himself pulled into the fray. The bright lights, the chatter, the fervor of the media now felt like a convergence of possibility, not an impending disaster. But then, out of nowhere, the crowd suddenly shifted, and a voice rose above the chaos. "Ethan." Panic surged through him as he turned to see a colleague rushing forward, eyes wide with urgency. The tension in the air shifted once more, and something in the young woman's face struck a chord of foreboding. He asked, mind racing. "They're reporting something on the news, a follow-up on the scandal." His heart dropped as a sinking feeling settled in his chest. This was not just about him anymore. The room buzzed with an energy that indicated the stakes were about to get significantly higher. She continued, urgency spilling from her words. As Ethan's mind raced, he could see his colleagues' faces falling, worry creeping back into their expressions. The media storm was upon them, but little did he know this was only the beginning. As he turned back toward the press, ready to confront whatever was coming, the realization hit him like a gut punch. Facing the media wasn't the hardest part. The real challenge had only just begun.